Hello everybody, welcome to another video. Tonight it is the 12th of September and we're looking at some really important developments that have unfolded over the past 6 days during my hiatus. I've been really busy with school and during that time period I wasn't able to really look at the situation keenly, and so these past few hours I've sifted through all of the major developments and mapped them accordingly. And unfortunately, we're going to be able to only do a general summary of these events. We're not going to be able to get into too much minutia about each particular part of the front line, although I will try to do that in the coming days over the weekend. But for today, I just wanted to sort of catch up and recalibrate with the situation, starting off with Vuhledar and then going all the way to the northwest to Kursk and the Kurakhove district. We're going to cover everything in between as well. And so it's going to be really informative for anybody else who has not been keeping up with every single exact update during that period. And then moving forward, of course, we'll look more specifically at unit changes in topography and the like. But I do want to begin by looking at Vuhledar and Vodiane. You can see in yellow, these are the Russian advances over roughly the past 6 days, and I have geolocated markers to indicate the regions where footage was published to confirm Russian advances. And then when you click on that footage, you could actually see the date on which it was either geolocated or released to the public. And this is how we get an idea of the timeline. And just to remind you guys, the Russian forces, they did not initiate head-on assaults into Vuhledar as was widely reported. What did happen, though, is you had several Russian squads crossing over the Kashlach River, getting control over some of the warehouses in northern Pavlivka, and that put a certain frontal pressure onto Vuhledar for the forces of the 72nd Mechanized Brigade, which is still present here to my knowledge, defending in the apartment buildings and in the node itself, and also in these plantations a bit to the south. They've continued to defend despite the Russian crossing of the river, but it diverted their attention as a more significant assault occurred both in Vodiane and towards the Yuzhno Donbasskaya mine. So the mine itself was captured by the Russians. You could also see that the slag heap was captured. You do have Ukrainian presence still roaming around this northwestern smaller slag heap, and so the Ukrainian activity here has not fully ceased. But here you can see just some footage of the Russians raising a flag in that mine, and they claim that during the engagements, not just in the spoil tip but also in the nearby mine facility, that 25 Ukrainian troops fled during that engagement and that another 30 were killed. So that's their claim. And in this general region, including the nearby field, they claim to have captured, and actually is verified to have captured, 9 square kilometers. And you're going to see that 9 square kilometers is a relatively small number in comparison to some of the other figures we're going to be looking at later on in the video. Now, in Vodiane itself, the Russian forces were able to take full control of the village also around September 9th. You could see that it began with initial assaults from the south, putting pressure on some of those more rural dachas, and then pushing directly into Vodiane, including the northwestern district, through some of the parallel diagonal tree lines that you see over here marked with these red arrows. And that culminated in 2 videos over here that you see marked. This one over here. Here you have another one where elements of Russia's Vostok drone detachment repelled an attempted counterattack by the 72nd Brigade and then raised their own flag in this district. And they also did it in the northwestern corner. Now, the Ukrainians do still maintain a presence in the Pivne Donbasskaya coal mine. That is important because it gives them a focal point that is pretty close to the front line that could prevent Vodiane from being used as a stepping stone to push further west and fully create a crest just north of Vuhledar, because that would be a worst case scenario in the sense that then the Russian forces would have control or at least overlook and be pretty close to any sort of escape route for the remaining Ukrainian forces in Vuhledar, because even now they're trying to hold on for as long as possible with the hopes that then it buys time for the rear forces to build up in an area like Bohoyavlenka. And so again, that puts them in an exposed position because the distance between Vuhledar and said village is around 8 kilometers, and there aren't any paved paths, so they're only crossing through open fields that really are dangerous at this point. The glue connecting them, as I said, is this one mine and its large facilities, and then some of the trenches that are dispersed across these tree lines, they are also included. And then just north of Pavlivka, there are a few other defensive positions. You have this water facility, you have the abandoned airports where Ukrainian forces are still holding But all in all, the Russians really have been able to avoid larger casualties in a really dragged out urban sort of fighting by advancing through Vodiane, advancing along heights and tree lines with their armored forces. And as a result, in the future, the trend is they're going to be able to put pressure from this northeastern flank, not only on Vuhledar, but then also utilize that as a ridge to push towards another area that is relatively isolated, being Bohoyavlenka. And in this case, this village does not have any sort of height advantage. At least Vuhledar is located on the dominant heights and also includes all of those apartment buildings. Bohoyavlenka is both isolated and also located on really low elevation. And so that southeastern flank for it is going to become a huge threat in the future as we really move forward. Well, just to look northwards at the situation around Novelska Pocket, as it's referred to, I called it the Vovcha River Pocket. This is where we've seen the largest advances, and it's a result of the Ukrainians finally being forced to withdraw. We're talking about several hundred Ukrainian forces who have just continued to maintain a presence east of the river for months upon months, even after the Russians captured Karlivka and really were in pursuit of making it all the way to Kurakhove. They still are, but they were on this campaign of just village hopping, reaching all the way to Halitsnivka. The Ukrainian command of these battalions, they had the orders to remain seated in areas around Krasnohorovka, the perimeter of Novelske, with the hope of, again, dragging out time, because this really large pocket over here east of the river is such a huge buffer zone. It really provides so much protection for the other villages that are located on the western bank of the river, including Kurakhove, Vovchenka over here. There are many examples of that. And so that's why even to this day, you still have this sort of buffer here, which is based on the blue demarcation line and is right now about 6 kilometers away from the river itself. It used to be much wider if you're measuring it. It used to be around 12, 13 kilometers, but recently the Russian forces have been able to take advantage of Ukrainians being stretched out, a lot of dugouts and defensive lines not being manned at all. And so they swept in and take control over a large portion of these gray zones. And because the Ukrainian forces were under threat of significant encirclement for whatever platoons remained over there, then they were also forced to withdraw westwards. And so you had the threat of encirclement for the Ukrainian garrison in western Novelske and in the nearby trenches. You had the same sort of fears, and you do still have those fears with this region located south of Krasnohorovka. We're going to zoom in on it right now to look at it in more detail. But you do have this region that is located south of the pond, which is a relatively open area, not really set up with any obstructions, but the Ukrainians did have some sort of presence here, and that was really knocking on the northern doorstep of Kharkivka and Marinka for a long time. At this point, their positions here have been rendered really, really dangerous. They can't really hold on to it at this point because of the pressure coming from the north, and so this pocket has sort of been closed off. And then you have the large general pocket that spans from the front line, where you have this one paved road that branches out of Krasnohorovka all the way to Zhelana Druhe. And that's an area that the Ukrainians are currently engaging in a fighting withdrawal in the sense that they acknowledge that they're not going to be able to hold on to it for an extended period of time. But the hope is they're going to have enough of wherewithal to then solidify control over these two villages and fight over them before the Russians eventually reach the river itself, at which point there would be immense pressure coming from the east, not just on the Hironik, but on other villages located further south. And again, at that point, you'd have just massive Russian capitalization off of the vast amount of territory taken over for setting up artillery posts, new sort of frontline hubs for battalions. Armored vehicles would have a good time roaming around here and using this one road to cross over towards other villages and across the river, so they'd have a new vector to really go through unchallenged. So there are a lot of benefits taking over this particular region, and that's why the Ukrainians were really contesting it for an extended period of time. When you're talking about elevation, there's not much of an elevation significance. This real entire pocket salient, you could say, east of the river is on a really low elevation. As we've said numerous times before, the Russian goal is to take over a lot of these heights, including located on slag heaps just north of Kurakhove. These are actually significant regions with massive elevation advantages for the Ukrainians in those particular regions. But to zoom in, you could see here in the Novelska region, the Russians took over 40 square kilometers. That's a huge number of fields taken over, and then 12 square kilometers in this sort of region north of Marinka, and then in between around 8 square kilometers. So just really significant numbers. Zooming in here, you can see that in Krasnohorovka, the Russian forces were able to finally cross over the Lozova floodplain, take over the vast majority of this northern horizontal-esque district. And then here we have a video of the Russian drone dropping a flag onto a building in northern Krasnohorovka. So probably at the time, September 6th, it was a gray zone. At this point, it's likely that Russian forward elements from the 5th Oplot Motor Rifle Brigade have already made their way towards this particular region and may have even crossed over to the Ukrainian forward defense hub in this warehouse. There are a few trenches nearby as well. And also the Russians have, of course, expanded westwards. The Ukrainians, again, did not have the wherewithal to hold on to these regions. You have Ukrainian battalion, like the 9th Battalion from the 59th Motorized Brigade, or one of the battalions from the Separate Presidential Brigade that have been holding on to the same positions without much of a rotation for 2 months plus in this really perimeter of Krasnohorovka. And so then when they're engaged with a significant amount of Russian really troops, not necessarily armored vehicles in this case, but just troops pushing through with artillery supports, then it's very hard for them to hold on really in the purview of the onslaught. And so here you have a video from the 5th and 100th Brigades. So 100th Brigade, a DPR unit that is also operating northwards near the Karlivka region, and so its forces are split up. Some of them have also been engaged in the capture of Krasnohorovka, and then we already talked about the 5th Brigade. And so they reached western Krasnohorovka. They, Russian soldier specifically, he raised on a motorcycle flag of the Russian Federation, and that's confirmation. Now, before I went on my hiatus, I discussed a really big possibility that the Russians were looking at, and they had launched at the beginning of the month these not insignificant, but they were smaller in size probing attacks just in the west of Krasnohorovka. And so this occurred either along the rail line over here that you see marked, or just south or north of it. And there were a couple of these incidents where the 46th and the 59th Brigades were involved in repelling those attacks. Most, they reached 10 vehicles at a time, with them pushing into tree lines and dismounting infantry. And so those were just sort of like speculative assaults, as I said, at the time. And now that we saw in the background this huge Russian consolidation throughout the entirety of the salient, there really still does remain the possibility of some Ukrainian troops being cut off, and the Russians being able to take advantage of the lack of a stable Ukrainian fallback line to push in another vector that has not been really tampered with that much recently. And so now we've actually seen the Russians go ahead with this plan, and they're doing so by advancing just west of Krasnohorovka. And I'm not talking about west through these houses over here, but west along the rail line to the south. And in the process, they've been able to not capture, but at least enter this really small village, Hostre. Hostre is the final village, you could say, before the Russians would reach the Vovcha River and reach the eastern outskirts of Kurakhove. When you reach the outskirts along the rail line, you arrive at an area like Ostrivske, and that's just really, really close to a massive Ukrainian command control hub. At this point, a lot of those resources have been moved past the Vovcha River to the north to an area like Andriivka, just due to how close Kurakhove is now to the front line. But in any case, it is still a significant settlement based on how the perimeter was beefed up with all of these trench lines marked in yellow. And so you can see that the Russians ramped up the intensity of their attacks, because I was talking about at the beginning of the month, Russian assaults repelled with around like 10 vehicles, 15 vehicles being utilized. But according to the 46th Brigade, today the Russians utilized 46 vehicles of different varieties. So that includes tanks, BMPs, APCs, motorcycles, using essentially all of what they had at their disposal, 46, and pushing along the rail line or pushing through fields to the north. And the air assault unit, it responded with large quantities of FPVs being directed towards the vehicles or towards houses in Hostre. Also, the utilization of cluster munitions towards clusters of Russian forces, because you did have some troops dismounted these houses. And that means at this point, there's probably not a solid Ukrainian presence, but there were some Ukrainian vehicles coming in from the Ostrivska region, just trying to provide suppressive fire towards the advancing Russians. And so according to the Ukrainian sources that recorded this, and they did show partially some of the damage that was caused during the attack, They say that they recorded 4 waves of assaults from 5:45 a.m. today to noon, and that in the process they destroyed a BMP, 2 tanks, 2 APCs, a motorcycle, and they also disabled 11 BMPs. So I meant to say they actually destroyed 9 BMPs. So when you add it up, it amounts to 26 vehicles either destroyed or damaged out of that 46. Again, that sort of half number, slightly more than half. Sometimes that's in line with numbers that are provided by other Ukrainian units like the 79th Air Assault Brigade. But in some examples of large scale operations, like using 50 plus vehicles, sometimes the ratios have been less, I've noticed. Simply because when the Ukrainians are mentioning such a large amount of vehicles being utilized, it probably means that a lot of the vehicles at the back of the columns really were able to turn away before being damaged due to the lead vehicles already being targeted initially. And so that sort of reduces the ratio in comparison to smaller scale assaults. But in any case, we know that the Russians have at least been able to infiltrate into Hostre, which is really a difficult situation for the Ukrainians because they still do maintain positions here in this eastern region, and they are very close to being cut off. Of course, they could cross over the river. There is one other crossing along Zoriane that can be utilized. There may be one around Zelane Druche. Some regions, the river is very narrow, but still, the attempt at crossing over is going to be monitored by the Russian forces, and they're going to try to strike them accordingly. And so this just puts another sort of pressure facet on the Ukrainians from this southern direction, pushing westwards into an area like Kurakhove, which the Russians are not only looking at attacking from the east, as we're saying, but it's really coming and culminating in a way that it would be a two-pronged attack from the Hirnik direction all the way to the northern flank of Kurakhove. That would be the objective, and that's where the Russians are pouring in the majority of the resources in the sector. It's actually not going into regions like directly assaulting Pokrovsk, but more so into turning southwards to this region over here, as we've seen with the culmination and capture of large swaths of territory recently. So as you guys all see over here, the Russian forces have made serious attempts at capturing Ukrainsk, and they've entered through several axes. As you zoom in, you can see the Russian forces have expanded control south of Lysivka, around 0.6 square kilometers, just taking over a lot of these forested regions near the riverbank. Also here, taking over just this region west of Lysivka, and in between that village and Ukrainsk, it's around 2.5 square kilometers captured. You can see here the Russian forces, they did not just try to enter directly through the entrances from Lysivka, but they also conducted their main maneuver actually by advancing, actually bypassing Lysivka from the south, because for a long time you had very strong Ukrainian resistance that prevented the Russians from fully capturing the hamlets. So what happened was the Russian forces had already taken over Dolinivka. They pushed from the south, got control over vacant trenches and forested regions, and then from there pushed into the plantations and pushed into this sort of southern direction where they're now in control over a large chunk of the town, putting pressure on the hospital region. That's when finally the Ukrainians were unable to defend because they were enveloped. They still are enveloped now, even to a larger degree. So not only are they enveloped, but they're also being overlooked by in a significant momentum being faced by them from 3 directions, and as a result they no longer had the means by which to hold on to an area like Lysivka. 25th Air Assault Brigade tried to consolidate control in Ukrainsk and sort of provide a solid line of defense along the eastern perimeter, but this was not possible due to the continued Russian momentum, and so the Russians actually were able to cross directly along this road and enter into the first houses of Ukrainsk in this northeastern corner, which is now marked as a gray zone. You also add this significant pressure on Ukrainsk from the north. You could see it's a polygon of around 5 square kilometers, plus this other one here that's around 2.2 square kilometers. So you could see that this salient has actually been able to cross past the yellow trench line that you see marked over here. Now that there is a permanent Ukrainian presence in most of this trench line, but it would have been a speculative fallback line for the Ukrainians had they lost Ukrainsk in the first place. But now the village hasn't even fallen yet, and the Russians have already been able to infiltrate this theoretic line from the west, and in the process also put pressure onto this Stakip over here, being able to flank it from the north and perhaps even capture it, it also creates, of course, a threat of cutting off Ukrainsk in its entirety, because you could see that the village is really being connected to the Ukrainian rear through a corridor of around 2 kilometers. So it's not that wide. You zoom in, the Ukrainians are only in control of some of the center, some like larger apartment buildings or duplexes, and then of course the large mine slag heap. So those are of course really well defended positions, and it's why the fighting has been dragging out for about a week. September 6th is around when the first Ukrainian sources admitted that the Russians had infiltrated, and now Russian sources are actually vocal, saying that they're in control over large chunks of the eastern side. And there's a really good reason as to why Ukraine's going to become a linchpin of fighting after really nearly 2 months of the Russians being able to advance from village to village without that much resistance in the process. Ukrainsk is really a key, because following the capture of such a village, not only would you undermine this really large trench line that we just talked about, this trench line that provides protection for the southern flank of Selydove, for instance. This area would give, of course, the Russians access to heights overlooking Selydove from the south, but also because then it gives the Russians a large amount of access to the rear in the direction of Turkunie, Hirnik, Kremina Balka, and all of this could be utilized in a way that could cut off a really large Ukrainian garrison that is stationed in the region either east or west of the Vovcha River. And perhaps that would not be a feasible scenario, but at the very least, it could help the Russians squeeze out the Ukrainians from this large area with all these villages and defensive positions out of there at a faster pace than they would have imagined. And then, of course, that has significant implications for Kurakhove. So that's why the Ukrainians are now trying to conduct a sort of important stand in Ukrainsk. They want to finally set the terms for where the line can be stabilized, and by holding out in a certain region, it prevents the Russians from going too deep in other areas so as to not expose their flanks too much. And then it gives the Ukrainians enough time on the rear to build up and enough time for reinforcements to arrive to help further stabilize the situation. But as you can see, Ukrainsk is in the process of falling, and the 25th Brigade already has positions in nearby villages. South towards Hirnik, this is an area that is still under significant Ukrainian control, but you can see that there are already signs of the Russians probing southwards, getting control over routes leading into Hirnik. Of course, also the nearby forested regions under their control. So that's something to look into the future to see those developments. You could see that the Russian forces have been able to solidify control over a lot of fields west of Mimrik. This is, again, part of a plan to get control over the southern flank of Selydove, which I believe will become important because you do just have this large open area that isn't that well defended, and that the Ukrainians are not sending their reinforcements towards because, of course, they're engaged with the urban battle. And this is an area that is a hole, but also is a hill, and that hill significantly overlooks the Solona River Valley, not just in Selydove, but then also expanding northwestwards. So it is an important Russian objective that you can see continue to develop in the coming weeks. Zooming in and actually looking at the urban battle of Selydove, the Ukrainians were able to send in the reinforcements necessary that we talked about to prevent a complete collapse of the city. And in the process, actually, they were able to gather up the forces and push the Russians out of the southeastern district of Selydove, push away the DRGs, get more confident control over dachas in between Selydove and Mikhailivka, and really isolate the focal point of the fighting to one small region. And that's always more favorable for the defender, because then they don't have to worry about a broad front being attacked, and they could just put more of their focus onto defensive assets in one specific area. And that's what they've done. They put a large amount of resources, the 15th Brigade, whether it be its 2nd Battalion or drone units, whether it be some other ancillary force that we are not aware of because we still don't have an idea of the 2nd Brigade that is defending hand in hand in Selydove. Some say it's the 72nd Brigade, but there's no proof of that yet. Others say it's the 117th Brigade, as I've marked on my map. But in any case, this sort of maybe 6,000 strong Ukrainian garrison in Selydove is now focusing on preventing the Russians from utilizing Seltranla Avenue as a route to push directly into the city. And so far, they've been successful in that endeavor, although the Russians have made marginal gains pushing into some of these regions, some of these houses over here and buildings. But again, most of the fighting is concentrated along this road, along the rail bridge, also along the rail line where you have back and forth shelling, FPV strikes, and the like. Still no proof of the Russians present in the northern section of this hinterlands or in the mine over here. I've been waiting for it, but nothing has really come out. And so it's very likely that the Ukrainians have done in the short term what's necessary to hold on to the core of Selydove. And now they're trying to move the fight away and push it eastwards just to buy even more time for their forces. Looking a bit to the north, an area where they no longer have control is Marinivka, the Ukrainians. They have been squeezed out, you can say. You can see here on the map that 2.7 square kilometers have been taken over by the Russian forces. Here we have the geolocations for that. You have a video from the 68th Jaeger Brigade of their tank firing towards Russian positions under heavy Russian shelling. There's a few other videos here, Russian FPV striking houses in Marinivka. And that would give us an indication that it is still a gray zone and that there's not significant Russian presence over there, because even though you have the Russian movement occurring south of Novohordivka, pushing along this vertical tree line, or presence in some fields to the east, it does not necessarily mean that they've been able to fully comb out Marinivka. And so for now, I'm leaving it in a gray zone, but definitely Novohordivka has been solidified and it's being used as a really important breakout for the Russians in several directions. The first one being in the southern direction, where the Russians are approaching the E50 highway from another sort of area, and this would have implications for the salient over here, the small salient, including a trench. And at that point, once this salient is disconnected, then there's no way for the Ukrainians to ever make it into Marinivka. And the next logical step would be the capture of this mine over here, which I still haven't seen proof that corroborates that the Russians are in control of it. So it could be a future objective of theirs. Looking northwards, you can see the Russians in control of this polygon here. It amounts to 4.6 square kilometers. It's just a large swath of fields west of Novohordivka that the Russians have taken over. Some Russian sources claim that they've been able to capture this Lysivka over here, just west of Novohordivka, and also Sukh Yar. Now, the implication, of course, is that the Russian forces, including their armored assets and then dismounted troops, would have been able to make it so close to the trench line over here, because you do have a solid line of trenches built along the southern and eastern perimeters of Mirnohrad and Pokrovsk. The implication would be that the Russians were able to actually inch towards it, and in one instance in Sukh Yar actually cross over the line and gain permanent control over the adjacent villages. Now, that is not verified yet, but definitely the Russians have made a push in this western direction, taking over the piece of territory talked about and taking over some forested regions and the first houses of Lysivka. So that's important to note, because this is a branching out, although it's not the most solid in terms of the shape on the map. The Russians being able to advance along a centralized vector through a village and take it over systematically would be a huge threat for the entire Ukrainian defense in this region, and it could play a role in finally finding the one gap that could result in a breakthrough. The thing is, the Russian forces, although there is some movement that we're going to look at in Hordivka, their main objective is not actually to reach Pokrovsk in a short amount of time and engage in a costly urban battle with Ukrainian forces that may be fatigued from months of defending and constantly being forced to withdraw, but are now actually getting supplemented with additional artillery and additional equipment coming in from other parts of the front line. More of an emphasis being put on helping out the Pokrovsk garrison, also in terms of manpower, with the movement of the 93rd Brigade, at least 4,000 of its men. And so it's not something that the Russians are keenly looking at right now to sort of break through and push into Pokrovsk proper and fight over there in a really difficult urban battle. Will be probably the third largest urban battle of the war, just because when you add up the populations of all the suburbs, and because a huge urban cluster, orders of magnitude larger than the Avdiivka region. And so you can imagine why the Russians would not be so hell-bent on going gung-ho into this region. And so they've sort of also been able to accept the new status quo around Pokrovsk, at least for the time being. As I've said before, they've shifted largely their focus southwards towards the Vovcha River region. But at the same time, we have to look at some of the Russian advances that have occurred. For instance, in Hordivka, capturing around a small piece of territory. You could see here marked with this geolocation a video of a Russian armored personnel carrier dismounting and then Sorry, it shows a Russian APC advancing through the main road of Hordivka into the center, engaging and actually destroying a Ukrainian APC that was also present near this main junction here. And then dismounts from that Ukrainian vehicle made it out and were picked off by Russian mortars and FPV strikes. So again, it's an indication that there's a battle going on over here, sometimes vehicle on vehicle engagements. Most of the Ukrainian forces are located in the trenches to the west. That also includes some higher elevated areas. But then throughout the day, they make their way into the houses and engage in the urban combats with the hope of just dragging out the fighting, because Hordivka, in the sense that it's an urban cluster, provides a huge buffer and a really important one for the Russians, unless they actually make it all the way to the trench line and break through it. And so for now, the Russians are still only present in the eastern half of Hordivka. Looking at Toretsk, we do have some movement over here over the past week. Russian forces really have been focusing on one specific direction. And so this, of course, yields higher casualties, some of which we have seen based on Ukrainian footage posted. But you can see the consistency in the Russian advances, in the sense that week after week, you do have several 100-meter advances by the Russians along the same road. And now they're really, really close, actually knocking on the doorstep of the main cluster of Toretsk, where you have these huge citadels, huge amount of apartments with the concrete slabs. And it's really close now, so the Russian forces could actually inflict direct fire damage onto these houses, and then vice versa. The Ukrainians could overlook and get a sight on the Russian forces advancing, and then, of course, fire towards them. But most of the damage is being caused by drones right now, so Russian forces advancing out in the open or advancing along some of these rail lines, roads. They're being spotted by Ukrainian drone crews from the Voron unit of the 100th Mechanized Brigade and being attacked by FPVs or grenades. So you have some of the videos showing Russian advances this past week. You could see the Russians approach the Toretsk micro-district number 1, as it is referred to, just this local base west of the correctional facility, which right now I've marked as a gray zone. Here you have a video from September 12th of the Voron FPV unit striking houses near to the Toretsk center. So the Russian forces were actually able to continue advancing all the way south of Dzerzhinsky Street and into, again, this micro district 1. That's the name of this part of Toretsk, south of the highway. And at that point, they were spotted by the drones and targeted. It's again confirmation of an advance. Here to the north, you had Ukrainians dropping grenades onto a Russian soldier near the bread factory, where there's also a Russian presence being noted day after day. And so again, you could see how the goal here is to make an initial foray, actually put pressure onto the Ukrainian rear, lest they have more time to build up, and then at the same time create this huge problem for the remaining Ukrainian defenders in this forested region, and also with the slag heap, because the loss of this region, which is becoming more likely given the fact that there is an envelopment being formed, would put a lot of danger and instill a lot of danger into the situation with the Zabalka micro-district in southern Toretsk. And so you could see an eastern direction, eastern flank be created that could threaten that particular part of the city of Toretsk. Zooming in on the Chasiv Yar region, the Russian forces have crossed over the canal in another region that we haven't covered previously. We already know they crossed over near the Okhtybarsky district and made their presence really known in some of those houses, sifting through with either elements of the 98th or 106th VDV divisions. Further north, the Russians were also able to cross over, take control over nearly 1 square kilometer. They did this through Kalinina, or through this forested region just south of it. I believe we discussed the Russian capture of some of these houses near the canal. It includes a significant forested area, some large structures such as apartment buildings, and just general facilities. Just to click on the map here to show you guys the confirmation, you have here video from the 3rd Assault Company of the Sarmat Battalion indicating heavy shelling launched by the Ukrainians towards western Kalinina. Over here, we have a few other pieces of footage, which we'll see if they're recent. This one is not. This one is not either. But then here you have a recent piece of footage released. This is from the Kartirinivka units of the 56th Brigade. That's the drone detachment, I believe, of the 21st Sarmat Battalion, which is the main unit attached to the 56th Brigade that is engaged with the defense of Chasiv Yar. And so they just conducted FPV strikes onto dugouts and trenches in forested regions west of the canal, areas that are relatively well covered in dense forestry. And it's an area that the Russians really thrive in at the moment. They have a lot of DRG crews operating here with hope of then solidifying control over the houses to the south. And at that point, they'd have the proper standing to advance westwards and control over all of these higher elevated slag heaps or quarries, whatever they may be. And that would actually put the Russians on foot and also overlook, or not necessarily overlook, but at least be positioned north of Chasiv Yar, as opposed to just advancing from house to house from the east. That is a massive advantage for them. Looking northwards, again, you have claims by Russian sources of the capture of Horivka. We do know the Russians have been inching closer along this eastern direction from Bodanivka, but also from some trenches and tree lines to the southeast. That's all true, but there's still no actual recorded proof to back up the claim that the Russian forces have been able to capture Horivka. An area where we do know of a Russian advance is, interestingly, northwest of Zalizhnyansk. So here you have a video from September 7th of a Russian platoon storming a Ukrainian trench within a tree line northwest of said village. And it just goes through the entire process of the Russians dismounting after the vehicles provided suppressive fire towards the trench. And then you see the methodical process by which several Russian squads go in and go from trench to trench, clear it out, throw grenades, engage in firefights, all of that. And so this defensive structure that the Ukrainians had set up was eventually taken over by the Russians, and it shows that they do have this new vector that we haven't been aware of previously, and that since then has not really been involved in any sort of larger advances, but it gives you an idea of how the Russians in the future can utilize the E50 highway and its surroundings to go deeper and deeper into the entirety of Donbass. But for now, we're looking at rather small advances. Now, looking at the Oskil River front, this is an area that is chronically underreported, and I understand why, because of all the developments unfolding in Donetsk, but really what we're seeing here is shaping up to really result in an eventual culmination that will eventually take over the headlines. And so to zoom in, you can see here the Russian forces in recent days have taken over this region, 0.7 square kilometers to the west of Pischane, and then over here to the north, taking over a territory amounting to 3.2 square kilometers, just generally fields and some tree lines. Russian forces advancing here has been verified based on videos of a Ukrainian BMP firing towards some of the tree lines the Russians have entered into. And to the north here from the 77th Air Mobile Brigade, their drones dropped grenades onto Russian forces during the nighttime. And so again, Russian forces, it's generally on foot, but sometimes tanks are also involved in this because of the sheer density of Russian tank regiments and also divisions more generally operating here. At the moment, they're only about, 5 kilometers away from the river, 5.2 kilometers away from the Oskil River, and 3.3 kilometers away from the nearest village. And so the Russians are extremely close to physically cutting off the northern and southern parts of the Oskil River bridgehead, which is really significant. The northern part includes Kupyansk and its suburbs, of course. The southern portion is much larger in size, but has smaller settlements. Most notably, if you go southwards, it includes some regions like Borova, Pidliman, areas that we are aware of from really 2 years ago when the Ukrainians were fighting to take it over. And so the connection between those two nodes will be severed. It could really be connected again through other intermediaries by basically crossing over the river to the west and then going southwards and crossing over from the east. But again, it just causes the process to prolong. And so just more generally, when it comes to logistics, it would complicate the situation. And then also it would give the Russians the perfect road, the perfect vector through which to advance either north or south. It could be both even. Southwards, you have endless opportunities when it comes to open areas that could be taken over, hills that could overlook various Ukrainian nodes or reinforcement points. Northwards, area that is relatively open, leading into the suburbs of Kupyansk. That provides a perfect route through which the Russians can attack into Kupyansk itself. And you could see how really their positioning is heading in a direction, basically, based on the regions that are being taken over in yellow. And I would really keep an eye out for these developments in the coming weeks. But we're going to move on right now to the situation in Kursk. So we're going to begin by looking eastwards, and then America waits our Glushkovo, which is, of course, the most notable. But the Russians haven't just counterattacked in Glushkovo. They also were able to take back some territory in Cherkasskoye Porechnoye. You can see the Russians were able to reclaim, based on geolocated footage, an area amounting to 13 square kilometers. Russian forces advancing along the P200 highway, then sort of branched off to the west and made it back into this significant ravine that has become central to the Ukrainian front line. And so to zoom in and actually look at the geolocation, you have here the Bravo team. It's a Ukrainian FPV squad, and they just conducted strikes and shelling onto a 10-man Russian squad that was operating in the houses here. And so the northern part of Porechnoye is actually not under full Ukrainian control. It's currently contested, and that's important because this is a relatively large settlement, and it also contains a road that then branches off and advances northwards towards another chain of villages for the Russian forces that is currently on their side of the line of contact, but is under extreme pressure. And so the Russians have sort of undermined this entire Ukrainian grouping by coming in from the east and just really putting this new pressure on. And that's going to prevent the Ukrainians, from focusing on areas like Nechayev, where they have been trying to infiltrate, or Naidenov. These are areas that they've really tried to push the mantle a bit forward in order to expand their own perimeter and then make it harder for the Russians to counterattack in the future. But that is all being undermined from the east, as I just said. Another area where the Ukrainians have made strides is over here, taking over 10 square kilometers, as I said before, in the direction of Naidenov. This is, of course, the culmination of a lot of salients being created by the Ukrainians and their mobile squads advancing, and eventually it creates a situation where Russian forces are forced out and try to consolidate in a more solid region located northwards, in the process, of course, ceding territory. So the Ukrainians also made their presence known in this village here, Khitorovka. Here you can see a video from September 6th of Russian FAB strikes onto that forested area, capturing in the process 6.5 square kilometers. And so one of the final regions that is still understood to be a gray zone is this region between Semenovka and Otradnoy. So this is an important area to keep an eye out for, because it's an area where the Ukrainian mobile squads are still relatively active from the 80th or 82nd Brigades westwards. Now we're actually getting to the meat and potatoes of the Kursk offensive and the Russian counterattacks. So we are all well aware of Glushkovo and how the Ukrainians, they sort of had an end game, following their understanding that their offensive will not be able to expand any significant amount deeper into Kursk than they had already been able to attain in the first couple of weeks of the offensive. They shifted their focus westwards towards areas such as Kurakhove or the Seam River Valley, all of the villages located south of the Seam River. That would be the final holding in Kursk that they could actually feasibly take over before a large chunk of Russian reinforcements organized in a particular point and begin to chip away at the Ukrainian holdings. And so for a very long time, you had Ukrainian forces, and we could get into details about the specific units, but they're here on my map, working at getting control of certain settlements that are connecting between Kurakhove and the Seam River southern bank, destroying bridges across the river. And this was successful in the sense that the bridges were destroyed, but the Russians were able to build pontoon bridges, move some heavy equipment across that was in risk of being captured by the Ukrainians. But at the same time, the Russians did not withdraw their forces entirely from this region, because they understood that there was still a possibility of holding onto it. And so the Russians really never left an area like Glushkovo. They never left a lot of these villages that you see marked in red on the map. And they were never pushed out of Kurakhove itself, despite the fact that for a couple of weeks, the Ukrainians have been putting pressure on the eastern outskirts of the town, and actually were able to make it into the smaller suburb called Kurakhove as well. They were never able to establish a firm foothold. Whenever they tried to go in, they would be met by very immense artillery and airstrike bombardment, and definitely played a role in preventing the Ukrainians from actually setting foot in houses and staying there for a long period of time. And so now what you're left with is this Ukrainian presence that is generally floating around an open area. And so they are able to move around this open area, not freely, but they can move through, and they're not physically stopped a lot of the time, and they can make their way all the way to the area east of Kurakhove, like Medvivka, Olgovka. But even now, Russian sources are claiming that the Russians have been able to fully capture Olgovka, and that as a result, the Ukrainians have withdrawn from Medvivka. And so you just have this very uncomfortable situation for the Ukrainians where they're not able to expand much in any other direction because the Russians have sort of cornered them in every area, whether it be in Olgovka or Kurakhove or northwards. They can't really expand, and so they're just left in the salient, which they could still roam in, but it is becoming more and more dangerous by the day. And so there's a question as to how long the Ukrainians could really continue to push into here without being exposed to incessant Russian bombardment and attacks. But just to zoom in on the area to the west, this is what's most interesting. So we know that the Ukrainian forces had a presence in the village of Krasnuk-Tiaborskoy and in the Glushkova forest south of Kurakhove. And so they were very close to physically cutting off connection between the two nodes that we discussed previously by actually reaching the Seam River. The issue is the Ukrainians got too bogged down with their fighting in some of these villages that they really should have completely solidified control over initially, like Komarovka to the west, or Vishnevka, or Krasnok-Tiaborskoy, which they never were able to fully get control over, or these forested regions. There were fires here constantly for the past couple of weeks, and that indicates that the fighting never really shifted past it. It really just remained here. So the Ukrainians were operating, but they couldn't fully sever the connection. And leaving that small corridor open for the Russians to then pounce on in the future, that was a huge setback for the Ukrainians. And some of it is out of their control because a lot of resources, not necessarily in terms of units, but more so materials, they were moved away from this Kursk region to defend in so many other parts of the front line that the Russians have advanced through. And so then the attention was moved away from the region over here in Kursk. And so the Ukrainians were not able to finalize their operations to take over the southern bank of Seam River because really it coincided with the Russians just continuing to advance towards Pokrovsk, Selydove, Kurakhove, etc. Really, that was a huge thing at the time, and we're talking about like late August. And so a lot of the attention shifted away from Kursk, and now the attention has sort of come back to Kursk, but in a really bad way for the Ukrainians, because even though the Russian forces, they did have to move some forces away from one part in particular of the front line, that being the Chasiv Yar region. They were not forced to redirect many forces from the rest of Donetsk, not necessarily from Vuhledar or from Pokrovsk or from any other region that was previously mentioned. From Chasiv Yar, you had some airborne units that were moved, and we'll talk about them in a second. And they were enough to build up this large strike force that is actually experienced and well equipped to counterattack. And that was always the Ukrainian fear, that they would not be fully prepared and fully in control of the situation in lieu of a potential Russian counterattack. And so now we're seeing the consequences of that. And you have men from the 103rd Territorial Defense Brigade, the main Ukrainian unit involved not in assaults, but with just sort of holding on to the territory taken over by the Ukrainians. And now they have been just completely overwhelmed. Their lines have been taken over, run over, you could say. And they're just continuing to fall back. A lot of their prominent drone operators have been killed in Russian strikes recently. And you could see, just zooming in, the Russian forces, they organized in Kurakhove a large column, like 10 vehicles, advancing along the vertical road all the way to Snagost. And so they sort of bypassed the fighting that was occurring in Krasnok-Tiaborskoy and just went heads deep into Snagost. And this, of course, created an issue with the salient, with the Ukrainian forces located in this dotted circle. And as a result, you had the Russians just continue to push deeper and deeper into the Ukrainian rear, and at the same time, the threat of an encirclement forcing the Ukrainians out of a lot of these villages. And so based on publicly available footage, either whether it be Ukrainian sources corroborating it or actual geolocated evidence, the sort of minimum amount of territory that I can mark as the Russians having control over is this region over here, this 4 square kilometer region southeast of Kurakhove, and then the 61 square kilometer region that is really in between the two nodes that I talked about, that being the southern Seam River and Kurakhove. And so in the process, you have at least 4 villages taken over by the Russians, and then the possibility that other villages were also captured, including 10th of October, Apanasovska, Biakhovo, Venezhepnoy, Gordivka, and pushing all the way to Ustinovska. Now, the thing is, this has all been mentioned by Russian sources, but there's not enough proof to back it up yet. but it would indicate that generally the Ukrainian lines were very thin here and that they were not prepared for any sort of significant defensive operation. That the entire reason why they were able to maintain control over this region is because the Russians never organized a sizable counterattack, and the Ukrainians were just continuing to advance westwards and westwards, but really in a thin manner that wasn't in a substantive way going to be able to hold on to this region for a long period of time. And so that's really threatening because now you have the Russian forces coming in with a lot of units into this region, including the 22nd Motor Rifle Regiment, which is a part of the newly formed 44th Army Corps. You have the Motor Rifle Regiment of the Russian Air Force present around here. You have the 51st Airborne Regiment of the 106th VDV Division operating in this region, previously operated around Chasiv Yar, as we've said before. You have 137th Guards Airborne Regiment, as we mentioned as well, coming from the Chasiv Yar area. You have at least one battalion of the 200th Arctic Motor Rifle Brigade. You have the 115th Naval Infantry Brigade, really important unit, experienced unit, fought around Novomikhailivka, fought and repelled attacks on Belgorod last month, now defending and attacking over here. And you have also the Kaskad units. Kaskad unit is located over here, not in its entirety, because some elements are defending or attacking in Vuhledar, you could say, and other drone operators are over here in conjunction with the Beaver drone units. So when I added up everything together, it amounts to somewhere in the ballpark of 9 to 20,000 troops. I'd say probably somewhere in between, around 15,000 Russian forces, with a large chunk of them being VDV elements, defending and now actually going on the counter in this region that you see marked in X in the Kurakhove region. And so that core 15,000 is involved in the counterattack. And they do have the possibility, I'm not saying that it's 100% confirmed, that they were able to reach all the way to Obukhovka. Now, the thing is, we have this video here from September 11th of Russian FAB strikes on Obukhovka, Snagovsk, and Kremennoy. Some of this footage is a bit old because you do have a lot of the preparation that occurred in lieu of the Russian attack, which included a lot of artillery shelling and FAB strikes, in particular FAB 3000s being launched on Snagovsk, for instance, and it's probably occurred around September 10th or 11th. And so it's not actually confirmation that the Ukrainians are still located over here. It's just like a old video, not really even old because it's like 2 days old, but just a bit outdated in comparison to where the front line is actually located. And the thing is, if Obukhovka was taken over by the Russian forces, then it would provide a really, really good avenue for them to push deeper into the strategic depth of the Ukrainian Kursk garrison, because they don't have a lot of static positions to defend in over here. There are paved roads and villages connecting to one another. And then we give the Russians the option to then just continue steamrolling through this eastern field all the way into a lot of the key holdings captured by the the Ukrainians during their initial advances in early August. That would be a huge fear for the Ukrainians if it were to come into fruition, which it really could if there was a Russian successful operation into Obukhovka or Lyubimovka. And of course, and then it also presents a challenge for the villages located over here that are sort of caught in the crossfire, that weren't directly attacked by the Russians, but are sort of just bypassed. It also means that a lot of these villages that are located south of the Seam River are no longer in imminent danger of being cut off from the main Russian garrison in Rylsk, for instance. And now you can see the movement of more equipment and troops across the river towards an area like Glushkovo to strengthen the sort of garrison over there. You also have, of course, a pontoon bridge being built east of Glushkovo. A new one, I believe, occurred around the 10th of September. So that will allow for more equipment to be moved back and forth. And at the same time, we see this video being released on September 12th of 3 MRAPs and 1 IMR-2 Ukrainian vehicles that were targeted by the Russian side, the Russian border guards, as they tried to conduct attacks onto Novi Put. Now, this is interesting because it appears to be an attempt by the Ukrainians to divert some attention away from the counterattack that has been very fruitful for the Russians over the past 3 days. So all of these reinforcements from this 15K that I mentioned, some of them, it would be hoped that the Ukrainians would actually be moved westwards to help really seal and prevent any sort of deeper Ukrainian infiltration. Because even though now the situation is sort of stabilized in a lot of these villages, the Russians don't have a lot of defendable positions here. It's just the villages themselves and then a large open field in between. So it wasn't really built to withstand a lot of these speedy Ukrainian assaults with mobile groups. So that's what the Ukrainians are trying to do over here with their operations in Novi Put. For now, the Russian reconnaissance from the border guard has been enough to spot and destroy a lot of them, but you could see a ramping up in such operations by the Ukrainians with the hope of opening up a new front nearby to distract the Russians, but also to try to gain some additional territory. The thing is that the Ukrainians would have hoped that they would be able to get control over the Seam River from the east. That was always the plan, based on their movements, based on how they were targeting bridges, based on how they were trying to cut off the river from Kurakhove. And now you're seeing the sort of irony that they've been pushed back even eastwards, and they're forced to try to open up new fronts to capture these villages from the actual border and attacking from the south. They also have these initial Ukrainian forays into Tedkino. You can see it marked over here on the map. This is a video from the Russian border guard. FPV strikes onto a house in southern Tedkino. This is so close to the border that, in effect, it doesn't really distinguish from Rizhivka, but it also indicates that there is a just slight increase in the Ukrainian intensity over here. Again, with the hope of directing some Russian attention away from their current successful counterattack. But I will say over the past sort of 12 hours, 24 hours, we haven't received too many concrete updates about the Russian advance. I'm just sort of recounting what's occurred over the entirety of these 3 days that we've known of a Russian advance, which could perhaps be larger than I have marked on my map. That's important to note. And on the Ukrainian side, it really is an issue in the sense that they really were banking on setting up positions along the southern bank of the river, turning it into a fortress that can then resist for an extended period of time and could be used in various ways, could be used to divert Russian forces, could be used as a negotiating chip. There are a lot of theories as to what it could be, but at the very least, they hoped to get control over one last piece of territory. Then now the Russians have been able to save from being disconnected from the main Russian nodes of Kursk, and now the tables are sort of being turned with a lot of the Ukrainian villages initially captured coming back into the gray zone, coming back into very fierce scrutiny, targeted by Russian bombers and artillery squads for the first time in a while. And so definitely it's a thing to keep up with. Keep an eye for the salients. That's what I'd say is most important right now. Look into the salient regions over here and see what is going on with the movement around those villages, around those roads as well. So yeah, that's all for today. I'm never going to make a video this long ever again. And thank y'all for watching. Goodbye.